All right, so hello and welcome to Researchers in Conversation, a virtual event hosted by Harvard University's Houghton Library and Harvard Review. Before we begin today, I'd like to acknowledge that Harvard University is situated on the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Massachusetts people. As a chartered creation of the Massachusetts colonies and Commonwealth, Harvard evolved alongside the persistence of the Massachusetts, Nipmuc, and Wampanoag nations. Located near the Charles River, we recognize the significance of this place, which has served many nations and the thousands of contemporary Native American people living in Greater Boston today. I'm Christine Jacobson, Assistant Curator of Modern Books and Manuscripts at Houghton Library. And before we dive in today, I want to invite you all to check out our upcoming virtual events on Houghton Library's website. There are a few remaining poetry readings hosted by the Woodbury Poetry Room this week and next, and a virtual birthday celebration for Emily Dickinson on December 10th, which will also feature Heather Cole. We hope to see you there. Over on Harvard Review's website, you can read poems, essays, and pandemic dispatches from places far-flung, including Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan, and Boca Raton, Florida. The journal is also currently accepting submissions. But on to the task at hand. Today we're joined by two wonderful Houghton Library researchers and authors, Heather Cole and David Gessner. We've invited them to speak about their recent books on Theodore Roosevelt, his legacy as a writer and conservationist, as well as their time researching at Houghton Library. So just to give you a sense of the proceedings today, we've asked each author to spend 10 minutes or so talking about their book. Then David and Heather will interview one another about their work, which I'm really looking forward to. And finally, David and Heather will answer questions from the audience. As questions occur to you, please do submit them using the Q&A feature. You should see that at the bottom of your Zoom window. You're of course free to use the chat throughout the webinar, but if you put your question there, I might not see it. Our session will wrap at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So our first speaker today is Heather Cole. Heather is the head of instruction and curator of literary and popular culture collections at Brown University's John Hay Library. Before coming to Brown, Heather was the assistant curator of modern books and manuscripts at Houghton Library, where from 2012 to 2017, she was also the curator of the Theodore Roosevelt Collection. She is the author of Theodore Roosevelt, a descriptive bibliography published this year by Knoll, and described by Greg Wynn, vice president of the Theodore Roosevelt Association, as one of the most valuable and important works of TR scholarship to be published in many years. The book has also garnered praise in the pages of the Washington Post and the Times Literary Supplement. Heather, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Christine, and thank you to everyone at Houghton and the Harvard Review for organizing this event and for supporting my research over the past few years. I want to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you today from Warwick, Rhode Island, the traditional homelands of the Wampanoag and Narragansett peoples. David may speak to this in his talk, but today we're discussing a public figure who, while he has many notable accomplishments, did not do at all right by our Native communities. All right, so I'm going to attempt a screen share. See how this goes. Nope. The host has disabled screen sharing.
Of course, one moment.
No worries.
It wouldn't be a Zoom talk without something happening.
Of course. There we go.
All
right. Okay, and we're off. Okay. So Theodore Roosevelt, or as I'm going to refer to him throughout this talk, TR, published 39 books in his lifetime, depending on how you define a book. Every scholar has a different count. Today, I'm going to focus on one of those books, African Game Trails, published in 1910. So it's 1908. TR is looking towards the end of a productive yet stressful second term as president, perhaps regretting his decision not to run for a third term. in part to completely sever himself from his presidency and to give his successor, William Taft, time to settle in without TR's large shadow looming over him. TR accepts an offer to travel to Eastern Africa to collect specimens for the Smithsonian's new Natural History Museum, set to open in March of 1910. Together with his 20-year-old son, Kermit, who was serving as the expedition's photographer, TR would spend a full year between 1909 and 1910 in what is now South Sudan, Uganda, and Kenya, pretty much shooting every animal in sight and having the time of his life. Now, both TR and many publishers saw this as a big money-making opportunity. They knew that the public would eagerly follow the safari, and a number of publishers began to compete over who would get the rights to TR's first post-presidential publication. So after weighing offers from a few different publishers, TR settled on Charles Scribner's Sons, with whom he'd worked on several previous books. Scribner's offered him $50,000 along with 20% of the revenue from sales. $50,000 in 1908, if I've done my kind of inflation math correctly, is equivalent to about $1.3 million today, which is not a bad deal for a popular president. This was understandably quite the coup for Scribner's, and they didn't keep it to themselves. The week that TR departed from Africa, they published this advertisement, reprinting a note in TR's handwriting that reads, "Messrs. Charles Scribner's Sons have received from me the exclusive magazine and book rights in whatever I may write about my forthcoming African hunting trip." So a teaser for their readers and a bit of a taunt to rival publishers at the same time. While TR was traveling and hunting, he submitted an article a month to Scribner's for publication in Scribner's magazine. Those articles appeared from October 1909 through September 1910. Before departing on his trip, TR requested that Scribner's provide him with triplicate carbon paper writing pads, which he used to write each article longhand. So he'd send 2 copies of each article to Scribner's, presumably to ensure that nothing was lost and the articles would arrive on schedule, and kept 1 copy for himself. The originals and the carbon copies are now in Houghton's Theodore Roosevelt collection, and it's pretty amazing to think how far they traveled to get there. TR's editor at Scribner's later recalled, quote, "Sometimes one article would come by way of Nairobi and the duplicate come down the Nile by way of Cairo. These blue canvas envelopes often arrived much battered and stained, but never did a single chapter miss," unquote. Each article was illustrated with photographs taken by Kermit and sometimes TR himself. TR was used to writing in uncomfortable conditions. Photographs show TR writing in tents while serving in the Rough Riders during the Spanish-American War. And pictured here is one of my favorite photographs of TR. This is TR in the South American jungle during his 1913 Brazilian expedition, composing articles that would later be published as the book Through the Brazilian Wilderness. Here, TR is protecting himself from Amazonian insects, but you can see that he appears to be writing on a similar pad as what he used in Africa, which makes me feel a little bit guilty about writing my book in my ergonomic chair in my cushy home office, but he was all about those extremes. So it was always the plan to turn those articles into a book, and as the end of the book's serialization neared, Scribner's began advertising around the country for book agents, who were door-to-door salespeople, who could help sell the book in rural areas and towns without bookshops. So here's an ad on the left looking for agents that ran in the Providence Journal in June 1910. Ads like this ran in hundreds of papers across the country. Each person who applied would be sent what's called a dummy, a book-like object that advertised different binding options, gave the customer a sense of what the contents and images would be like, and usually included an order form where they could commit to buying a copy. Not many of those dummies survive, but luckily enough are still extant that I was able to get a sense of how the book was marketed. The image on the right is the dummy from the Houghton Library's collection, and the list of folks who have signed up for a copy, those are all from Taunton, Massachusetts, so they were all interested in ordering one. Scribner's was convinced that African Game Trails would be a bestseller. It's really kind of hard at this point to comprehend just how popular TR was. This is a photo of the crowds lining the streets of New York to get a glimpse of TR and his return from this African trip. I mean, that's like 20 people deep on both sides of the street. And it's believable that many of these people would want to purchase a book about the trip. Also, TR had first found literary success writing about hunting and outdoor life in books and articles about the American West, so it's safe to assume that African Game Trails would do well. To capitalize on this popularity, a number of different editions were released simultaneously in August of 1910. All included a large number of photographs, along with a map detailing the route that TR took through the continent. So the first on the left was printed in an edition of 20,000 copies and priced at $4. This edition was issued with a dust jacket and high quality illustrations. Another edition of 50,000 copies was printed slightly more cheaply and was available at $3.75. A third edition, available through subscription by those roaming agents, was available at $3.75 as well. That printing included a number of additional illustrations. Both of those editions appeared in the middle binding on this slide. All editions were available at higher prices and fancier bindings if the customer so chose. In addition, Scribner's also licensed the printing plates of that mid-price edition of the book to the Syndicate Publishing Company, which released an edition available to order through various newspapers for 98 cents each, and that edition is the one on the right. As if that wasn't enough, a fourth luxury edition appeared in October of that year. It was 2 volumes instead of 1, issued in a slipcase and bound in 3/4 pigskin, a nod to the Pigskin Library, a set of his favorite books that TR took with him on the trip. This edition was limited to just 500 copies, and each copy was signed by TR. Translations of the book were published in London, Paris, Berlin, and Stockholm in 1910, and the book was serialized in several newspapers around the world, including in Australia and South Africa. So with all of these choices available to a wide range of customers, how did the book sell? The short answer is actually not that well. One of the clues that tells us this is that while all of these different editions were being offered at different price points in 1910, there were no additional printings after that group. So this is really unusual for a book by TR. Even before he was president, some of his books went into so many printings that it was very difficult for me to track them all. One example is a biography that TR published in 1887 of Jacksonian-era Senator Thomas Hart Benton, which appeared in at least 24 editions between 1888 and 1914, 15 of which were published before TR was president. TR's final book, Theodore Roosevelt's Letters to His Children, planned by TR but published after his death in January 1919, went through 9 editions in 1919 alone. Another clue comes from TR himself, who in this 1911 letter to his son Kermit writes, "African Game Trails has sold moderately well during the last 6 months. Not very well, only moderately, but not badly." A few years later, in 1915, the books were basically being remaindered. One could buy a copy of African Game Trails for $2 at Carson, Peary, Scott & Company, a Chicago department store. Scribner's records also show that the limited edition was not fully sold until 1925, just 15 years after publication. So why did this happen? This might offer us an answer. This is a selection of piracies or other kind of printings of topics relating to TR in Africa that also appeared in 1910, purporting to document all of TR's adventures. So this is just a selection. I couldn't fit all of the books like this on this slide. Many of these come from the Houghton Collections. TR had nothing to do with any of these publications. Others were capitalizing on his popularity, and there was a huge market of souvenirs that one could purchase, from coloring books to toy figures of TR and the animals that he hunted. It's possible that the market was so saturated with so many books and other items that no one really needed the official one. It's also possible that the serialization of the book decreased interest. It's true that TR's books that were compilations of articles or speeches tended not to sell as well as others, but that's not always true across the board. Another factor was that in 1910, according to the New York Times Book Review that year, the United States for the first time published more books than any other country. So African Game Trails would have been competing against many other titles, including new novels by Jack London and H.G. Wells, an important work on the North Pole by Robert Peary, and many others. Many of the other books advertised heavily that year were priced much more affordably than the $4 cost of TR's books as well. One last reason may be that TR was always working on something new, and maybe readers were just interested in his next adventure. Ultimately, we can't really know, but these were probably all contributing factors. The story of African Game Trails is just one of the aspects of TR's life that my bibliography explores, and by looking at the publishing history of such a popular figure, we can get a much more complete sense of how that popularity was reflected in the wider culture. Thank you. Stop sharing, there we go.
Thank you so much, Heather. That was fascinating. I'm really looking forward to discussing it more further. So our second speaker is David Gessner. David is the author of 11 books that blend a love of nature, humor, memoir, and environmentalism, including the New York Times bestselling All the Wild That Remains, Edward Abbey, Wallace Stegner, and the American West, and the prize-winning book, The Tarbell Chronicles. In 2003, Gessner taught environmental writing as a Briggs Copeland lecturer at Harvard University, and he now serves as chair of the creative writing department at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, where he is also the founder and editor-in-chief of the literary magazine Ecotone. His own prizes include a Pushcart Prize, the John Burroughs Award for Best Nature Essay, the Association for Study of Literature and the Environment's Award for Best Book of Creative Writing, and the Reed Award for Best Book on the Southern Environment. In 2017, he hosted the National Geographic Explorer show, The Call of the Wild. His most recent book, Leave It As It Is, A Journey Through Theodore Roosevelt's American Wilderness, was published this year by Simon & Schuster. Robert Redford described the book as a thrilling journey in nature, a history of Roosevelt and the Antiquities Act, and a rallying cry in the age of climate change. The book has also garnered warm reviews in the pages of the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Book Page, and Library Journal. David, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Christine. Before I start, I want to say, Leave It As It Is has sold moderately well over the last 6 months. Not poorly, but moderately well. I hope it gets better. Thanks, Heather. That was great. So cool to see TR hunched over writing with that table in the middle of the wilds. So I thought I'd start by talking a little bit about my relationship with Houghton Library. I had none during my years as an undergrad. I had mainly as a freshman, I had played a game of stoned tag in the tunnels that run below Lamont and Widener with my roommates. That was my library early interaction, but it evolved into kind of a love of the Woodbury Poetry Room and what people in chat have told me is called the Child Memorial Library. And I hung out there. I wasn't a great student. I had certain classes I loved, and one was with Walter Jackson Bate, the great biographer of Samuel Johnson, and John Keats, who has a huge influence on my work, particularly in the sense of looking at biography as something we can put to use in our own lives. That's one of the really exciting things about biography. And certainly that's true with Roosevelt. The things Heather was saying, I think we'll get into more of his flaws later on, but obviously you don't go back to pluck out those flaws to put to use. You go back to pluck out the things that can help you. And for me, reading Edmund Morris, I think, Heather, this is a fact check, I think it came out around 1979, The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt, in that ballpark. I read it in my early 20s when I was pretty depressed about my prospects as a writer. And I found the energy in that book to be so contagious that I found it very helpful in kind of getting me going to write. And so I've circled back later in life to Roosevelt. The first time I used Houghton was for a book called Return of the Osprey in about the year 2000. And this was a book that was kind of in the Thoreauvian genre, a year on Cape Cod in this case. And I was getting obsessed. You can see Audubon's osprey back there and another photo over here with ospreys. And for some reason, it got it in my head that one of the things that was important was transcendence and lifting outside of self. And I found out that Emerson's journals were in Houghton. And I wrote in that book, and I've written in recent books about how it feels like a holy place when you go into Houghton. And I'll just read a couple lines that, as I told Christine, sadly were cut from the Theodore Roosevelt book, but this gives you a sense of how I felt about working there. Well, I had visited Houghton before and thought of it as a holy place. I knew the rituals inside that high-ceilinged, quiet room, surrounded by portraits of the long deceased. I handed the card with my request to the research librarian, and he walked over and sent a message to those below in the building's bowels. I apologize for this part in case either of you worked there. They're the subterranean workers. It was hard not to imagine them as blind and somewhat mole-like. Searched the caverns and found the thing from the past I requested, retrieving it from the clutch of time. They placed the relic in a small airtight elevator and it rose up. Then the librarian brought it over to where I was sitting at the long table and placed it delicately on a gray foam wedge. And that's meant to echo a bit about kivas and Roosevelt descending into a kiva later in the book. Once Emerson's journals was handed to me, and I intentionally selected one, I was 38 at the time, selected one from when he was my age. It blew me away that I was reading his actual writing on the page. And as we discussed it yesterday, he had very good handwriting, and he indexed things at the back so I could look up flight or transcendence. And it was very intimidating for a journal keeper like myself to think how sloppy mine were in comparison. But that began a new phase in my writing where I tried to present research as drama. One of the issues I had with Return of the Osprey was I had to convey a lot of information, and I was worried about it being too dry. So I'm more of a nonfiction writer. I'm a little bit of an ugly duckling here today than I am a researcher. But I thought if I present myself as getting obsessed and reading more and more and learning everything about ospreys to the point where later on I smeared fish on myself and ripped a fish apart to get the feel of osprey. If I present myself as obsessed, I can thread in a lot of the research. As I was leaving that day, a silver-haired gentleman had two large boxes. He was wearing a yellow slicker and two large boxes, and I opened the door to Houghton, and kind of instinctively, I grabbed the top box to help him out, which revealed the fact that it was John Updike bringing his papers in to Houghton, which blew me away. Skip ahead to the Roosevelt book. I'd already been thinking about writing about public lands. I had as I mentioned, a love of Roosevelt from when I was younger. And I was asked in December of 2016 to put a piece in an anthology that was going to be presented to Congress about Bears Ears National Monument. I was kind of the token Easterner in this. The Western writers had written this up. And when President Obama declared Bears Ears a national monument in December of 2016, I felt really connected and empowered to that in that moment. So 11 months or so later, when then Secretary of the Interior Ryan Zinke undeclared 85% of that land, and did so standing in front of a portrait of Theodore Roosevelt on the day that would have been October 27th, would have been Roosevelt's 159th birthday, and declaring himself a Roosevelt Republican. Although my euphoria turned to kind of rage, and I decided I had to write a book that focused on public lands, on saving public lands, on our environmental future, and on Roosevelt. I really didn't write I knew I was going to have a biographical thread, but that was just going to be one thing I wove throughout. I didn't consider myself a biographer, more of a biographical adventurer. And my early research was all, secondhand. It was all reading the biographies, every biography I could get my hand on. But I also knew that as a writer about place, I had to go to the places that were important to Roosevelt. So the next summer after school ended, this would be 2018, 2018 by then, I launched a trip starting where I live in North Carolina. And I brought along my nephew who just graduated from college at University of North Carolina, Asheville. And we traveled up the East Coast to Washington, where my former classmate in college, Jamie Raskin, was a congressman. Talked to him back then when the House of Representatives was red. He felt totally disempowered. Since then, that's changed. We headed up to Roosevelt's house, and it was fun to have Noah along, to have the younger generation commentating on what was going on. He didn't like all the dead things in TR's house. He didn't like listening to books on tape about Roosevelt and hearing his speeches, and he got really sick of the phrase manly vigor. He liked the dude on The Big Lebowski, not Teddy. So, and then we went up to Harvard, and this will kind of illustrate. It just so happened it was my reunion. We stayed in Winthrop House, which was about 100 feet from a sign I had somehow managed not to see while in college, on what used to be the indoor athletic building, that said, "Here, Roosevelt spent 4 fruitful years in whatever those years are, Heather. You can type it into the chat. But I remember thinking, I always loved the John Muir line, when you pick up one thing, you find it hitched to everything else in the universe. And that was never more true than with Roosevelt. Suddenly I ran into my classmate, Nancy Boudelier, who had played point guard on the basketball team, and told her what I was working on. And she recited the whole man in the arena speech to me. I ran into another classmate who'd named their child Teddy. I found not only Houghton, but that great room up in Widener where shelves and shelves of Roosevelt work. And then bizarrely, at the end, I took my nephew to the 7th game of the NBA playoffs, Celtics versus Cavaliers, and LeBron James had written on his shoes, "The man in the arena." So it was just like this confluence of things. So I went into Houghton, and unlike previous times, I didn't have a lot of time to do it. I was just stopping in, but I had an idea of what I wanted. And two things came up from the subterranean world below. And one was a description of when Roosevelt was 14 and he went down the Nile and he was describing the birds that he saw there, and it was kind of in journal form. And it was a journal. And it was stunning. And as Edmund Morris points out, two things had just happened, two gifts. He'd gotten a pair of glasses and he'd gotten a gun. So like Audubon before him, what he was doing was shooting a lot of these birds he loved. But I also think in his writing, birds were kind of the launching point. Heather mentioned 39 books. Well, the early writing focuses so much on feathery things that fly. And again, it's like a getting out of oneself. And the other journal I got was of the time he chased the boat thieves from his ranch up the Little Missouri. He had just been out, it was winter, and some thieves came along and stole his boat. And he and his two ranch hands built a boat to chase them in through this chock full of ice river. And as he was leaving, I always remember that he grabbed Anna Karenina so he could read it in the back of the boat while they're riding them. You read a little Tolstoy while you're chasing boat thieves, which really gets at one of the things that's so thrilling about TR. Anyway, we can talk as we chat with each other. I'll cut it at this point, but I continued to follow Roosevelt, and it culminated in going to Yellowstone, where he'd been with John Burroughs and left the press behind and spent a full day watching elk. The Grand Canyon, which gives the book its title, it's where Roosevelt stood on the edge and said, "Leave it as it is. Man can only mar this," right? So, and then finally with John Muir in Yosemite, or as it is now called Yosemite or Yosemite by our still president. So I guess when we get chatting back and forth here, one thing that's interesting for me is when you describe what Roosevelt was doing, he was really writing on the heels of experience. He's like a reality show unto himself. He's typing up those notes that night and sending them back home. And there, Philip Roth writes about some writers like to have that long perspective afterwards, and some do well writing directly on the heels of experience. So to me, that's, so my research really involves creating a drama, first doing the primary research where I've read as much as I can possibly read about and by the figure, but then letting serendipity take over a little bit and seeing who I run into. Then there's an element of place, like when I'm in the Badlands, spending nights camping there, I felt like that really gave me insight into what it felt like for Roosevelt being there. And then, Heather, you were mentioning the interviews. Generally, I talk to people have no problem with that, with the phone recorder on now, and then trying to recreate that feeling. So in the book, you feel as if you're learning along with me. So that's the general approach. And just a few years ago, I got kind of bored with the more pastoral, straight sort of book I was writing and wanted to start playing chess on 3 levels. So it's like have a biographical thread, have a travelogue thread, have an environmental thread, and then see how you can weave them together. And I generally start with an outline, but a writer I admire once said to me, good writers make outlines, great writers throw them away. So the outline, is the initial map, but then, all bets are off once you hit the road and start experiencing what you'd mapped out before.
Thank you so much, David, for that wonderful window into your research and writing process. So I think what I'll do now is I'm going to physically cede the floor to David and Heather. I'm going to turn off my video. And I think I speak for everyone when I say I think we could listen to you all talk for a very long time. But maybe to give you guys a sense, I think the floor is yours for the next 26 minutes or so.
Not 27. We're gonna
just to go into 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Yeah.
How do we do on time there? I felt like I was going on too long. So
it was perfect. Absolutely perfect.
Okay, there you go. Your picture's still here, but you're. So Heather, are you up and running over there?
I am here. I'm ready to go.
So just let me tell you one coincidence in terms of libraries is years ago, I wrote a book called The Prophet of Dry Hill that was about John Hay, the Cape Cod nature writer. And his grandfather was Teddy's John Hay, which, as people in the audience probably know, he had quite a life. He was also there while Abraham Lincoln was dying at his bedside, where he was a secretary. Later, he works for Mr. Roosevelt. But John Hay, the John Hay I knew, was a naturalist who said, strange to have been through the whole century and find that nothing was more interesting than the birds. Or maybe it's just that the human mind is more interesting when looking outward, which a line of his I always kind of cling to. Yesterday, I'll ask you a question to start. Yesterday, Christina was talking about the romance of research. And as you can tell, for me, it's a little bit of a rushed experience, kind of a little more haphazard. I wondered, if you can talk a little bit about the kind of marathoner's mindset of knowing you're going to explore everything. And does romance carry it along to some degree? Do you get absorbed in the aura of Teddy in this case?
I think so. I think, any researcher who comes to TR kind of does get swept up in the drama and the might and all of his kind of the things that we come to him again and again for. Romance-wise, I had very romantic views about this project that I was going to embark on about 7 years ago. Oh, this is, I'm the curator of this collection and no one's really ever done this before. Wouldn't it be great to combine my interests in bibliographic description and history with Theodore Roosevelt and all of the great writings that he produced? I wasn't too far into it before I realized, oh, this is why no one has published this before. It's kind of impossible, just tracking all these different printings and articles and everything. So for me, I just saw that as a challenge, trying to kind of track this down, to use all my librarian skills to figure out why it was or how all of these things that kind of, as I talked about, made him more popular, or kind of the different complications that arose when he got into kind of arguments with different publishers over rights and money and things like that. So it was fun. It was fun to kind of track all those down. So I don't know if it's not kind of romantic in that sense of just like looking at a whole bunch of books and counting the pages that are in them. But for a librarian, for a rare book person, that was very fun.
Well, somebody should do a book just on TR and coffee.
Yeah.
For someone to write that many books and that many letters and do everything else he did, he had that big coffee cup that, I don't know if you saw a picture, it's more like a bowl.
Like a bowl, yeah.
And he would start in the morning and drink through the day. And then I think Edmund Morris said until he energetically went to sleep. And as people may or may not know, good to the last drop, the Maxwell House saying was TR's saying. I think maybe, I mean, there's a famous quote, let me make sure I get it right. What he wanted to be, Alice Roosevelt, his daughter, said my father wanted to be the corpse at every funeral, the bride at every wedding, and the baby at every christening. And he was even maybe more than our present president, and in a different way, certainly, he was a sinkhole for attention. And what's been fascinating to me, and probably for you too, as our books come out, is how much he's in the news. I mean, still, just some random chunk of time. When I finished writing the book and sent the draft off that week, Elizabeth Warren said, this is my favorite president. And it seemed like every subsequent week there was something else. Most famously this summer, Trump comparing himself and saying he was as good as or better than him as a conservationist, but also the statue being being taken down in front of the American Museum of Natural History, which TR's father was one of the founders of. What people don't know is that they're renaming the Hall of Biodiversity after Roosevelt. And to me, that seems a good jumping off point. Yesterday, we said that we were somewhat like-minded about his flaws and his strengths. And that's clearly an example. The statue in question, for those who haven't seen it, is pretty awful. It's TR on a horse with an African man and a Native person basically naked walking beside them. And so I support having the statue come down, but naming the Hall of Biodiversity after him, I also support. This is a guy who, when he was a teenager, didn't want to be a statesman or a soldier. He wanted to be a working naturalist like his hero, Charles Darwin. And one thing I write about a lot is how that influenced everything he did, and certainly saving public lands and caring about the natural world. But anyway, so I wondered if you could talk a little about your wrestling with this kind of, we come to him. John Muir said when they were together in Yosemite, could I help it if I was half in love with him? And a lot of us are half in love with him, but we also have some problems with him.
Yeah, and I loved how you expressed a lot of that in your book as well, that he was such a progressive leader, but we want him to have worked so much harder. So for women's suffrage, I want him to have, I think he could have achieved that while he was president, and he sort of shied away from it, or he wanted women to kind of work harder to achieve it themselves, which, I mean, they were, man, like they were working pretty hard. And
so he does come back to that, right?
Yes,
During Bull Moose, where, I say that platform would have made Bernie blush. And he pushes suffrage then, 10 years, almost a decade before it happened.
Yeah, there were a lot of prominent women who were working hard in concert with him on that platform, which is great. So he did evolve, which I admire. But there's so many things too with, as I was going through kind of his later books, and I think you wrote about this as well, like they become increasingly strong on pushing these different points, whether it's, he had this idea called race suicide, which is kind of one of my main issues with him, which was basically eugenics. It was just saying like white women need to have lots and lots of babies to ensure that the white race doesn't die out, which is incredibly problematic. And as progressive as he was in so many areas, I wish that I could have a little chat with him about some of those issues. And I know that you covered a lot of that with different Native communities in your books, and how he wasn't so great. He wasn't so progressive on those issues.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about Native communities. I thought that was great the way you both began the talk. Before we do, I think we're getting into a really interesting area of historical empathy, of like how it's come under fire, kind of. We used to cut a lot more slack to historic figures and say they were of their time. But as you point out, if we give them, like for instance, we give Roosevelt credit for being ahead of his time when it came to environmental issues. Well, if we're going to give him credit for that, we have to hold him accountable when he's, in the case of Manifest Destiny, it's 50 years old when he's basically spouting those things. So he's behind his times. He's not even of his times. On the other hand, there are a lot of times people kind of cherry pick passages out, like they recently did with John Muir, where I just feel like the historical empathy is like imagining them now and where they would be and imagining yourself then. Pretty common sense stuff. We don't expect, people who lived before Newton to talk about gravity. We have to approach it with empathy, but also critically, I guess.
Yeah, and what one of the ideas in your book that hadn't occurred to me, and which I really enjoyed reading about, was that TR's idea of the American West, of the American wilderness, was one that was sort of this virgin wilderness with no people in it. And obviously that is not at all how that wilderness was for most of the history of this land. And your thoughts and your considerations with the people who are there, with those communities connected to those lands, of how maybe it's better that we don't have some of these spaces be public lands in the way that TR imagined them. And I wonder if you could kind of talk a little bit more about that.
Sure. So my book kind of took a turn. Like I mentioned, make the outline, but maybe throw it out at some point. And the big turn it took is before I did my summer-long trip, I went out on a scouting mission in January of 2018, and I went out west. And I talked to a couple of people. One of them is the woman who's going to be publishing my next book, Kirsten Allen. And they pointed me toward Regina Lopez White Skunk, who's a Ute Mountain Ute member of the Bears Ears Coalition. And some people know this, but what a lot of people don't know is that Bears Ears was the first national monument that grew out of the thinking, planning, and effort, like a 5-year effort of 5 native tribes, the Navajo, the Zuni, the Ute Mountain Ute, the Ute, and the Hopi. And it was originally planned, the ambitious plan was for those tribes to co-manage the national monument. That got lost in the battle to get it through. My hope is that if Biden restores it, he's also going to restore that co-management. But so I went and my first interview was with Regina Lopez White Skunk. So it's interesting to be writing about TR on the one hand and talking mostly to Native people on the other. And she said to me, look, we're not trying to address like historical trauma. We're not trying to say we want our land back. We're trying to use an American tool, the Antiquities Act, and in a new way, in a more inclusive vision of public land, one that involves ceremony, traditional plant use, traditional knowledge. And it blew me away. It changed the book in a lot of ways. For me, it culminated when I went to the Bears Ears celebration. The ears are 2 buttes that are this is in southeast Utah, that are at the top of Bears Ears. And for me, it took the old Rooseveltian vision of conservation. We think of that as the rough draft with all its flaws, and it revised it for the present and maybe for the future. Wallace Stegner called national parks America's best idea. And I say, well, maybe they were just a pretty good idea in some ways, and we can make them a better idea in the future. So that whole Native vision for a national monument got me thinking, Roosevelt is still relevant. And the truth is, even though I am critical of his taking native lands, really it might not have been a choice between a native paradise and a park. It would have been a choice between a park and some condos. So we have to be appreciative. It's a complicated thing. We have to be appreciative of what he did, at the same time being aware of historically the cruelty of ripping those lands away.
And I think you and I both experienced something similar when we were in the Badlands. I think you said that it rang a bell in you when you were out at that. And I had the chance to go to Medora and the Theodore Roosevelt National Park at the invitation of the Theodore Roosevelt Center, and had an amazing hike with Clay Jenkinson, who's one of the deans of Theodore Roosevelt out in North Dakota. And I wasn't prepared for how emotional I would be when I was in that space. our group was sort of followed by a group of wild horses as we were walking, and it was in November, so there weren't a lot of other tourists, and the buffalo were out. And I feel like that was the most visceral kind of connection to what TR was trying to do and what he experienced out there. And it sounded like for you, that was something similar, that kind of similar emotional feeling.
Yeah, and I really do believe, again, the flaws are over here, but I really do believe all my writing has been about place and about loving places and trying to protect places. And I really believe he got it. I say early in the book that he might have suffered from other prejudices, but not from anthropocentrism the way, pretty much everybody else, with a few exceptions. I mean, in that way, he was like-minded with Native people in some ways, because he really was able to get outside of himself. And I think that early training as a naturalist and then being there in places like the Badlands, some of my favorite writing, I don't know about you, are in those early books where it almost reads like, like Hemingway-esque. It's these kind of lyric moments that are so beautiful. Then, of course, the next sentence he has to shoot something, but it's still lyric and kind of stunning. And being there in that place, what's the line? To him, it looked like Poe's poetry sounded. It's like Utah, but different. It's like nothing else. And my nephew Noah loved it. Our first morning we woke up just like you. We opened the tent and there were buffalo grazing. So that was an extraordinary moment to be there.
Yeah, TR is a really good writer. For anyone who's not read any of his works, I mean, yes, he wrote a lot of books, but he's really good at describing place and experience and the animals that he's seeing and their behaviors, whether he's writing a letter to one of his children about something that he saw or something he thought that they would enjoy, or he's writing an article. He's just so good at describing all of that. And it's kind of too bad, I think, in that like his books aren't as widely read. Some of his essays, as you say, on sort of the experiences out west, even if he is tearing a bear apart with his bare hands or something like that, it's exciting, there's drama there, and he really knows how to put together a narrative in that way that is compelling for folks.
Well, at the risk of making myself sound like a worshiper of pugilistic, military, white old leaders, I'm also a little bit of a Churchill buff, and I see an overlap there psychologically, like Churchill's Black Dog. Like part of the reason he was constantly active when he wasn't, saving England, he was building walls as a mason, was his own fear of like kind of falling into a depression he had when he was younger. And for me, I mentioned my love of Walter Jackson Baden, what we can put to use from these figures. The move out to the Badlands obviously is spurred by, for people that don't know, he's 24 years old and he loses his wife and his mother within the course of a day, basically. And so there is an aspect of battling depression. And, he writes joyously of the natural world, but he also, that's where I think the Black Care, line about do you know offhand the full quote? Seldom sits behind a rider who is moving fast, basically, is the gist. So all that hyperkinetic activity, staying in the saddle for 24 hours, when he isn't reading and writing, and there's a little bit of an edge of desperation sometimes to it, and there's a little bit of not wanting to fall into the abyss. So I find that really interesting psychologically with him.
Yeah, and I think, it's something that a lot of us are experiencing in this crazy year. 2020 has been a challenge for so many reasons. But, for me, at least, in that, like, thinking about TR and coming back to nature, when I've been sitting at home anxious about what's happening or what is in the news that day, I can look out my window and I watch the birds. And I never did that before. I had no idea all the different kind of biodiversity in my backyard. So like just those kind of little things connect me to TR and make me think about how he dealt with some of those challenges and things that he was kind of going through. He always goes back to nature.
Yeah, I think like, right, I mentioned yesterday when we were chatting that my next book is about Thoreau, and it's grown out of the pandemic, that love of discovering your backyard. And the real link I feel with Roosevelt is related to birds. And I mentioned that John Hay quote. I really do think his ability to go outward, outside of himself, whether he's playing with the kids on the White House lawn, or getting into conversation, or I think I saw Sharon Gilzer is here from the Theodore Roosevelt Center, and she said to me during the talk that, don't forget, he was also a great friend. He had these great friendships. And to me, that's a pretty healthy sign that, that ability to go outward. But in terms of the natural world, it's been so important to me during the pandemic. I'm lucky enough to live on Hewlett's Creek, also known as Dawson's Creek from the TV show. And if I push off from there, I can get out into the world. And this morning I saw bald eagle, which aren't that common here where we are. And I think that's a large part of the reason he continues to be so attractive, is that ability.
So you talk about the importance of recreating or preserving these migratory patterns of different species out west rather than containing them within these artificial boundaries of the national parks. Do you think, is the pandemic having an effect on those migratory patterns, or fewer people kind of getting in their way?
Yeah, early on, I mean, the phrase often used in the West is rewilding. And early on, we saw these graphic examples of, the two mountain lions strolling down through the streets of Boulder in the snow downtown, and other examples. Suddenly, they could see the Himalayas in the village, So there was, it's not as dramatic as we'd hope, but there have been some examples. But what you're referring to is, I stand by the fact that parks were a brilliant idea, and that our public lands are hugely important, though flawed. For an example would be Bears Ears, our most recent, is the brainchild of native tribes. Bears Lodge, also known as Devil's Tower, was native sacred land that Roosevelt declared with the very first Antiquities Act, use of the Antiquities Act National Monument. So that's progress, right? But I still believe in public land. And the one problem with parks is, as biologists say, islands are where species go to die, and parks have been islands. So the real exciting stuff going on in the West is the idea of connecting parks, as you're calling it, the migratory pathways. And one of the most successful is Y2Y, Yellowstone to Yukon, where we're allowing large carnivores to travel north and south into Canada and up to the Yukon. And you have bridges, overpasses, and underpasses that are vegetated that the animals now follow. And it's been really successful. So I think that one of the things that we love about Roosevelt are the big, bold ideas. And I still think there are big, bold ideas out there. And it's very easy to kind of curl into a mental fetal position about climate change and everything. And I think one of the lessons of Roosevelt is that rather than kind of, shrivel, basically follow that boldness. And we're not all him, and we don't all have his advantages or his pulpit, but we can emulate him in smaller ways.
And evolve in thinking. And that's something I really admire about TR, is how he may have started with one idea, but then he would talk to experts. He would admit that he didn't know everything on a particular topic, even as he would kind of feverishly research, and he would be open to learning more and to changing his mind. I always think that's something that politicians can take a good lesson from, that evolution of thinking.
Yeah, I actually was very happy when you showed those early slides, because I was feeling a little imposter syndrome being here with researchers. And then I thought, well, that's Teddy doing it right on the heels of it. And there are just different ways of writing, and we've gotten so subdivided. I teach so-called creative nonfiction, which didn't, a word that Roosevelt practiced but didn't exist during his time, right? And I'm getting all these reviews of the books from historians, and I'm like, why aren't you talking about the writing? Why, why are you just treating me like a historian? So we're all in this, to go back to Emerson, an American scholar, the idea of busting through those various fences and still, being a Renaissance person is what one of the other things that we get from Roosevelt. And one of my favorite quotes is, reading for me is a disease, and the fact that he was reading a book a night at one point in his life is inspiring and somewhat insane.
Yes, well, and then he'd be able to recall it decades later, word for word, whatever he'd read, and I don't think any of us can aspire to that.
Yeah, Churchill could do that too. I always say that's like someone said in the comments about him being a genius, and actually Edmund Morris has a line where he says Roosevelt acknowledged he wasn't a genius. He always, and that's partly because of his emphasis on effort. In his autobiography, he talks about, I tried harder, basically. But he did have certain innate gifts, and that memory was one of them, just to be able to recall lines he read in grade school, basically.
Or in other languages. He's incredible. Well, your book is very readable and very well researched. You know your stuff about TR, so I definitely recommend everyone take a look at that.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm like sitting here in awe and thinking my next project I'm going to take longer than 3 years on, so that I can come back to Houghton and be a proper member of the Researchers Guild next time. Sounds like we're kind of pausing in such a way that we wonder, Christine, if there are any questions that we can address.
Yeah, I just thank you so much for that. That was fabulous. Perfect. Exactly 26 minutes. Well done. Yeah, in fact, the questions are literally pouring in. So I think it would be great if we could spend the next half hour answering some of them. The first one is from Christina Thompson, and she writes that it's for Heather, but I would love it if you could both answer this. What was a great discovery or maybe a big surprise that you encountered while doing your research?
Not too many great discoveries, but it was interesting to see how many of books that I was like, Thomas Hart Benton, who is this guy? Like Gouverneur Morris, other like folks from American history who nobody knows they are anymore, how popular those books were. So thinking about that sort of historiography of what aspects of American history went be popular to a different reading public at a different time. And then how popular TR was before he was president. He was pretty well known for being this naturalist, this writer, before he became kind of internationally famous for his public service, for being vice president and president. And then how many translations there are of his books. Pieces of his work were translated into Japanese and Finnish, and it really made it all over the world. So he truly was an international figure.
And for me, I guess I mentioned when we spoke yesterday that I teach in a graduate creative writing program, which I call the Temple of the Woke. And I was nervous approaching this figure, knowing the area, the cancel culture we're in. So I guess what surprised me is how many people still embrace him and how many Teddy fans there are out there. I mean, I knew there would be a lot, but it's just amazing. You run into people and you start telling them things and they're like, well, no, I know that already. It's like in the bar in Medora where I heard the biker guy talking to the stockbroker, and they were telling the story of the French ambassador who, swims naked but keeps his gloves on in case they meet the ladies, and they were laughing with each other. And I was like, whoa, this is a different world, a Teddy world.
Excellent. Okay, so we have a process question from Andrea Coelti. And I think this is for Heather, yeah. Heather, would you speak briefly on the processes you used when you began to identify the titles before you got into identifying all of the issues and editions? I'm particularly interested in how you identified all of the serial imprints.
Well, I had help, and I haven't talked about this yet because I didn't have time initially, but my co-author was a man named R.W.G. Vail, who was the first librarian of the Roosevelt Memorial Association, which TR came around before there were presidential libraries. So sort of an independent organization that started collecting as much as they could on TR in order to build the recreation of TR's birthplace, which is now the run by the national parks in Manhattan, and TR Theodore Roosevelt National Museum. It's his birthplace. You can look that up. But anyway, so there was a great library there, and Vail was the first librarian. So he sought almost 100 years ago in the early 1920s to complete a full bibliography of TR's works. And he got pretty far. The Roosevelt collection at Houghton has hundreds and thousands of note cards that he typed his findings onto, but it never got published. He wanted to see it published, but he went on to different roles, and it really never kind of went further than that. So when I was the curator, I just kind of discovered this and thought that would be fun. And so like he was kind of my my collaborator from beyond the grave. I wish like we could have had some conversations, but it was really fun to kind of see his notes in different books and then find, you know, where he wasn't able to discover something or figure out different titles. I have the advantage of the internet, which made things a lot easier for tracing different things. So that's a lot of that kind of initial listing. I definitely owe to him. This project would have gone on for 50 years if I had to start from scratch. He also had the advantage of working so closely to when TR was alive that he could contact a lot of publishers and get their takes, their memories of working with TR or information on different editions and things. So yeah, thanks to him.
Do you have an actual number of books about Roosevelt that existed?
Books about TR, hundreds and hundreds. I mean, they're still like, as you and I know, they've been publishing all the time. So while he was alive, there were tons of books about him. The collection at Houghton has, I have no idea, several thousand books about TR, going back to early on. So he's been consistently a popular figure.
So maybe number 2 to Lincoln in pure pages? Yeah,
probably. I don't know, Jefferson is up there too, and kind of other founding fathers, but he's definitely up there.
It's one thing we didn't mention that's kind of interesting too is the way he's appealed to both conservatives and liberals, the way Nixon quotes him while leaving office after Watergate. Obviously, FDR emulates him. Kennedy throwing the football on the lawn is kind of a recreation of Roosevelt roughhousing, and it's pretty amazing. Even Obama said a couple of years ago he was his favorite. So.
So going to go to a question now from Janet. I think you've both kind of talked about this tension in TR with his love of nature, but then the next minute he's killing something or bragging about killing something. So Janet asks, aside from specimen killing and animal killing for food, how much was TR's hunting for sport? How did TR reconcile his hunting with his conservation efforts?
You want to take it, Heather?
I guess it was, I don't know if you want to take a stab at it first. I don't have a ready-made answer for that.
I don't think he rationalized it. I think he just, he loved hunting, and, even later on when he tamped it down a little, partly for political reasons, he was chastised by John Muir during their famous camping trip where they skirted civilization and went out in Yosemite. And, Muir chastised for him, called it childlike, basically. But, he considered it, I don't think he early on was apologizing for it, the primal thrill of it. And then I used to say our cat Tabernash, who grew up in a trailer in Boulder, Colorado, was never more cuddly than after he'd killed something. And Teddy had those two weird sides to him where, he could beautifully describe the light shafting down, and then, I mean, he wasn't hunting for food. I mean, he
Well,
ate.
he ate some of it, yeah. He wrote in his Africa diary, "Rhino meat good." So he was trying that. But there was one story about him in Africa where he was in a little rowboat, and suddenly the rowboat starts to sort of rise above the water, and there was a hippo beneath him. So he just starts shooting into the water, and he killed lots of rhinos, and he sort of snuck away. Like, I don't want anyone to know about that. So like I think he was aware of the excess, but part of it was conservation for him, preservation study, and just that idea of like, I'm gonna bag an elephant.
Yeah. I mean, you have Audubon, right? Who's basically an avian side, like through the landscape, who's also a great naturalist. I think John mentions he saw hunting as conservation in the chat.
Yeah.
That's right. That's another example of him evolving too, that the quote John has there.
Yeah. So the other side of this coin, we have a question from Nayli. What do you think is the greatest threat to TR's legacy in terms of his environmentalism?
Well, there's a famous essay of his. I won't try to remember the full name, but the metaphor he uses is walking a ridge through his political life. And on the one hand, he abhorred he was called a traitor to his class because of his trust busting and fighting the wealthy. On the one hand, he despised success for success' sake and mere monetary gain. And on the other, he despised reformers who don't budge, who are just so extreme, what we would call like kind of the most woke at this point, basically, or the most dogmatically intolerant in the name of tolerance, I would call it, on the other hand. But when it came down to the two, he hated he called it the man who through the chicanery of deceit gains basically high office, stands toward society as a wild beast. So on the one hand, you have kind of the most extreme conservative dislike of conservation. On the other hand, you have dogmatism. And I think those are the two threats to him too. I think if we take him down simply because of his flaws, then we can take down what's best about him, the conservation. But obviously the moneyed interest and the greed, which we've seen so much of in recent years, the fracking and ripping up of public lands is the greater of the two threats, I think.
We have an interesting question on this topic from James. James writes, TR took on big business and monopolies. If we put his values to use today, what might be his attitude to big business that has denied climate change while contributing to it, or that lobbies heavily in order to maintain the regime of greenhouse gas emissions?
You want to tackle it, Heather?
Oh no, you're the conservation guy. Go ahead.
Well, I just think that's a perfect, I mean, one of the things I say in the book is that Roosevelt doesn't just fight for conserving land. He creates the arena in which the fight happens. I mean, he's talking about this thing they don't understand. Like, really just put it aside, leave it as it is. So one thing he was really good at, we've mentioned he's an intellectual and he's a big reader, but he also distills it into popular language. And I think he could articulate the climate fight in a way we haven't yet, as a life or death threat to us, and put it in dramatic language and put it out there as the biggest fight ahead of us. And certainly he would have the balls, for lack of a better word, or bravery, I guess I should say, to take on the fossil fuel industries. And so in that way, and I also think he would probably be taking on the Facebooks and Googles of the world in the trust busting manner that he took on the railroads and other monopolies.
Even at the same time.
A little riled up.
although he would have loved social media, I feel like, I mean, that would have been such a great platform for anything he wanted to communicate. He would have been on Twitter nonstop.
That's right.
So since David's been in the hot seat, I think I'll throw a couple of questions Heather's way. We had one question about if there's a particular book you might recommend as an introduction to Theodore Roosevelt's writing. He also says a favorite. So I'm wondering, I'm choosing to interpret that as, do you have a favorite, Heather? And then we had another question about whether or not his writing changes significantly after being in the Amazon.
Okay, yeah, so if you want to get a sense of TR's writing, I'd recommend some of his early books on hunting, or even just finding some of those early essays where he's describing the hunting. My favorite book of his is the last one, Theodore Roosevelt's Letters to His Children, which is really just, you can see kind of the human side of TR as a parent, where when he would travel, he would write these amazing letters to each one of his 6 children. And they were all sort of personalized to that child's interests and little stories that he thought they would enjoy. And he would illustrate these letters with these amazing little cartoons. And so like that is a wonderful collection of those. The children always referred to them as posterity letters. They always felt that TR was writing them with an audience in mind that was beyond just them. So they read really well for any audience. So those are those two extremes. I would definitely recommend. If you're interested in TR's writing as a whole, beyond my book, which is more of a reference work, this book on Theodore Roosevelt, A Literary Life by Thomas Bailey and Catherine Joslin is really great to kind of learn about his writing as a whole. Kathleen Dalton's 1-volume biography of Theodore Roosevelt, if you want to get a sense of his life and how those books fit into it, is a really readable 1-volume biography if you don't want to tackle the 3 volumes of Morris. And then there was a last part of that question now that I forget. It's about.
Yeah, do you have a sense of whether his writing changed significantly after his trip to the Amazon?
I don't know if it changed. Well, as the world got into World War I, as TR kind of was looking towards the elections of 1916 and possibly 1920, he really started getting increasingly, the word is necessarily, but like really sticking to very extreme ideas. And the last books are really, I don't find them to be readable at all. I don't know how you feel, David, but like or he's kind of ranting and using that as a platform as this person who doesn't really have the same power anymore that he used to complain about Wilson, to complain about Wilson's policies towards not getting the US involved in World War I yet. And they get kind of desperate, I think, and they are hard to read.
Yeah, as a 59-year-old, I don't really like how 60 looks in the TR world. He's so militaristic too, and pushing the boys to be on the front line, and kind of imagining World War I to be a recreation of Cuba, where you're on horseback. You know, it's just not the romance of war kind of thing.
David, while we're talking about books on TR, I saw that you seconded the Kathleen Dalton recommendation. Are there any other books that you particularly like or that inspired your book?
Well, you know, it's kind of, McCullough's Mornings on Horseback comes out pretty much the same year that The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt came out, and I think they're both great. But I give the nudge just a little more to Morris's book and the first book. And it's just that he's a hell of a writer. He died in the last year. And he does that thing, which I think I mentioned Walter Jackson Bate for in his biography of Keats and Johnson, and in all my favorite biographies, where you just, you know, he mixes an appreciation of the writing, the psychology of the man, or person, and just this, you just get absorbed in this story in such a way. I think it's a brilliant book. I agree with Kathleen Dalton. That really helped me understand what, you know, Heather's talking about both the kind of maturing of the later years and then the going off off, having a wheel come off at the very end. She also writes. She also writes that the real evolution. We haven't talked about it, but the famous, his father coming to him and saying, "You must make your body," and then we go into this kind of upper class Rocky montage of Theodore working out and becoming, muscular. She says that the real transformation wasn't that; it was the growth of empathy that occurred through his career, his ability to look beyond, his small self and his class, basically.
Yeah, so we didn't really get to talk about this earlier when you were both talking about his views on race and the concept of race suicide. But Derek asked a really great question. How do you reconcile his attitudes with respect to race suicide with his personal friendship with Booker T. Washington, Paul Laurence Dunbar, Quanah Parker, and others, as well as his seat on the board at Tuskegee?
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly evidence of how, again, TR is evolving on a lot of these different issues, and he didn't kind of come to any of his ideas on his own. He always wanted to seek out folks who were coming from different communities or were experts on things that he wasn't expert in. And I think those friendships are really important, and certainly did help him evolve on a lot of different ideas. Could he have gone further? Yes. And I don't like to dismiss it as, oh, he was a product of his time, because he did have this kind of ability to evolve and to change and to see things differently. So, I think we can still fault him for a lot of the things he did that weren't good enough. You talk about that too in the book too, David.
Yeah, I wonder. I'm blanking on the name of the kind of racial theorist who he blurbed his book near the end. Maybe somebody can put it in the chat. He was also a Buffalo Preservation. Madison Grant. Thank you, Sharon. So one thing Kathleen Dalton does at the end of her book is, that I write in mine that people say they were great buddies. And I say, I know from experience that blurbing somebody's book doesn't mean you support the person. And Kathleen Dalton says that Roosevelt also called him an addle-pated ass. She also writes about this tribute that the NAACP writes about him when he died, saying we had a great friend in Roosevelt, citing the Booker T. Washington, but other things too. That said, those theories you're talking about are real, and this is not to forgive them at all. They were in the air more than people realize, pre-Hitler, right? And some even think Grant influenced Hitler, and Hitler read Grant. But this is a case where I think if you took Roosevelt and flipped him over onto the other side of World War II, there's no way a person with that basic makeup isn't going to evolve the way many intellectuals did. And I'm not trying to forgive him here. I'm just saying that, yeah, he had a couple places where he made the wrong turn. But we're sitting back. We don't know what people are going to say about us in 100 years, too. They're going to say we elected Trump, is what they're going to say. But sorry. I didn't say that.
Well, I'm really glad that you finished that note on this question of legacy. We have a really interesting question from Ryan. Ryan writes, I apologize if I missed this earlier, but what are your thoughts on the plans to build an actual Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library in the Badlands of North Dakota? An opportunity for more people to know, understand, and research the legacy of Roosevelt near the cradle of conservation at Elkhorn Ranch?
So Christine and I are both, full disclosure, on what's called the Storytelling Council for the Presidential Library. So a board of experts who are helping the museum to consider what content they're focusing on. And that's been a really exciting process so far. Everything is being done real carefully, and they don't want it to be sort of a place where they're putting TR up on a pedestal. But like our conversation today, reconsidering the issues that he stood for, where he could have gone further, and making the space a real kind of place of connection and conversation. So I'm really excited to see it come together. It's slated to open in 2023, is that right? And the architects that were just chosen are doing really interesting things with sort of carbon neutral design and building materials and just making it look like it's part of the Badlands landscape. So I think it is going to hopefully draw new people to that area and help them learn more about not just TR, but the Badlands and the ecology of that space. So it's exciting to be a part of that and to see that come together.
And I just love the idea of it growing out of that place. And, you know, as we both said, to know a person, to know their ideas, go and know the place too. And so to me, that's exciting.
So we have a question that invites you to look back on your legacy and maybe provide a little introspection on your work. Eugenia writes, as time passes and we all evolve and change, if you change opinions and if you might change your opinions and views on what you have written and see it under another lens and approach, how will you feel about your work and how you feel considering such a possibility?
You want to go, Heather?
I mean, I guess with a reference work, the easiest way to see where you made the mistakes is to publish it, and then immediately they jump out at you after many rounds of editing. So that's at least my more immediate thoughts about the book. But I hope that with the reference work, it just kind of creates more information for future scholars to take or to help with their own research. So whether or not other people can improve on it or find new things that I didn't find, I hope this gives them kind of a starting point.
And for me, though, mine are books, you know, and as I said, sometimes reviewed by historians, my primary impulse is essayistic. You know, I'm coming into it as an essayist, and mistakes are our bread and butter. You know, the old to try thing with essays, right? And so I'm more in the manner of, say, an Ed Abbey, or I'm not claiming to be on their level, but, you know, in the spirit of Montaigne, and, you know, or a current native writer like Robin Wall Kimmerer, whose brilliant book, Braiding Sweetgrass, I'm reading right now. I'm trying to kind of chart the flow of my own mind. And that, of course, implies changes and contradictions and hypocrisies. And they're there on the page. I mean, you're kind of, you know, there's a weird double lens here, right? Where I'm writing about TR, but I'm also writing about my own response to him. And so it's just I just assume I'm going to look back on that person and think he was a little off.
So getting back to research, I think, you know, we have two questions, one for Heather and one for David. So I'll pose them both to you. Heather, what are the resources that you use when you track down editions or numbers of prints that a book had? And David, Leslie was interested in knowing, was there anything that you found in your research that surprised you about Theodore Roosevelt?
The main places I checked were library catalogs, looking at WorldCat and the catalogs of individual libraries, which are not always great because of how library cataloging works and because of the kind of small differences between different editions. A lot of the times I had to go in person to look at a book or to ask somebody at that library to make some scans for me. So that was invaluable. Also working with booksellers who deal in Theodore Roosevelt books, the way that they described them was very helpful, and kind of checking in with folks who had nicer editions than I could find maybe in circulating collections as well. So those are kind of my main places. But then all of the resources in the Theodore Roosevelt collection at Houghton, that was the main starting point, main place for this research, because that initial collection that Vail worked with is now at Houghton. So I could really look at his notes, the editions that he used, in some cases the editions that TR had seen. So that was really useful, but I traveled around to a lot of libraries to compare editions and look at different things.
And for me, I'll circle back to Houghton. Also, seems a good way to end too, is, you know, I tell my writing students that on the one hand, this is, as TR would say, all about effort. I mean, the combination you need of luck, effort, and talent, basically. And you do improve, obviously, as a writer. We talked about TR evolving as a writer. On the other hand, you know, say you lose something on your computer, a few pages. I've had this happen before, and I rewrite it. It sounds curiously like the thing I lost. Because as writers and as speakers, we all have fingerprints, kind of. We're all ourselves. And so what surprised me was seeing so much of the adult TR in the 14-year-old TR that I was reading about going down the Nile in Houghton, and reading these lines that were full of this delight in seeing a sandpiper, at the same time had some good humor in there and mixed with the Latin. And you know, you could say that the stamp of TR was already there, or at least the seed of TR was already there in that boy, basically. And so to me, that was a really eye-opening moment that I enjoyed.
That's fantastic. We also did have one request from Janet, if you could hold up your books. I don't know, Heather, if you have one handy. I know David has both at hand.
I'll hold up both.
Fantastic.
The
And
dust jacket
David
for mine.
is out from Simon & Schuster. Heather's is out from Oak Knoll. I'm sure you can buy them on their websites or wherever books are sold.
And I had a wonderful editor, Stuart Roberts. I got orphaned in the lingo of publishing where my editor left. But he was wonderful, and he allowed for all these, he did searches for all these prints that are throughout the book. And the book is broken up into interludes that are written kind of in the third person as Roosevelt. And those sections each have a map that you know, kind of follows. That's actually the Yellowstone to Yukon corridor going up from Montana. And then the other sections have these old photos. So I was really pleased with the care and effort they put into it, even if it sells moderately well during the next 6 months. Not well.
It looks beautiful, and I have to say Heather's book also got mentioned in the Times Literary Supplement for being very handsomely produced. So I hope you all seek those out. And I know that even though we can't see you, I know you're all joining me in thanking Heather and David for this wonderful discussion today of their recent work. Thank you, Harvard Review and Houghton Library, for co-sponsoring this event. And I hope we'll see you at our future events.
Thank you,
So
Christine, for being a good host.
Thank you, Christine. Thank you, Christina. Thank you, Adrian. Thank you, Heather.
All right.